Oke, gabung lagi kita nih, ketemu lagi di Cakap Sapa yang Art Talk. Hari ini kita ngobrol-ngobrol santai ya, tapi juga bisa lebih mendalam juga sama Wilson Hermanto. Wilson Hermanto ini conductor ya, udah lama di Europe sekarang. Kita ngobrol tentang orchestra music in movies. Nah, ini menarik banget. Kenapa? Karena banyak sekali film-film yang dikompos dengan pendekatan orkestra. Pendekatan orkestra tentunya beda dengan pendekatan yang direkam satu persatu, tapi beda juga dengan pendekatan studio. Ini karena benar-benar playing on the same time dan composing on a big screen gitu ya. Kalau kita lihat banyak sekali film-film, terutama film zaman dulu, karena dulu belum ada teknologi yang digital gitu. Tapi sekarang kita lihat masih ada beberapa yang begitu gitu. Kalau misalkan kita lihat Star Wars contohnya masih setia dengan pendekatan itu. Bahkan film-film yang mungkin kesannya nggak high art atau pop aja kayak Home Alone atau mungkin Superman dan lain tetap dalam pendekatan seperti itu. Tapi maksudnya kita ngomong dalam kerangka seperti itu bukan ada yang lebih hebat atau lebih jelek, tapi kita coba menembak dari sisi gimana kalau orang yang paham soal musik klasik dan sebagai konduktor pastinya Wilson juga bisa sharing-sharing tentang ini. So welcome Wilson di Art Talk-nya Cakap Sapa. So
welcome.
Yeah. So what do you think about this approach in composing and orchestrating a movie?
Thank you so much, George, for the invitation to join your chat. I'm very happy to spend this time together with you. First, to answer your question, the history of motion picture making, if you look at the early part of the 1920s, you have to start from the time when it was still a silent film. So, and the silent film was actually more or less inspired by the world of operas. So if you talk about the world of operas, then we are talking about theater and music combined together. And in the early years, you know, many composers who wrote the music for those silent films were actually the leading composer of their times, who were known to the public as the classical composer. Now, I have to explain to you, the word classical is very often misunderstood. When people say, oh, I play classical music or I listen to classical music, you know, actually it does not mean classical music like a museum music, because we're talking about music which span from the Renaissance period, from the 16th century, even 15th century, all the way until the music of our time today, written by living composers who are all alive. So very often the word classical music, people thought, oh, the composer were all already dead, but that's not the case. So when I say the early years of the history of silent film, the composers who were actually famous writing those music for the films were the leading classical composers of their day. That means that at the time they were all actively working and living. So, you know, in those early years, I could name you, you know, a few names that I think people, recognize. The composer Richard Strauss. Richard Strauss, by the way, had no relationship with the waltz composer king Johann Strauss. They had no relationship. Johann Strauss came from Austria, the family of Johann Strauss, father senior, the son junior. They were known as the king of the waltzes, right? But Richard Strauss was a composer born in Bavaria. He was born in 1864 and died in 1949.
Right. What an interesting take that you're saying, because it comes from the silent era, right? So it derives from there. The original thing about all this orchestra composing and movies comes from the silent era. So you were saying about a composer?
Right. I refer to some names from the past whom actually they were the leading composers of their days. Among other composers was none other than Richard Strauss, the famous great German composer Richard Strauss. And he was very known in his life during the beginning of 20th century, 1909, 1910, after his opera called Der Rosenkavalier was performed. It became a hit. You know, imagine today if you have, if you go to Broadway musical and, you know, you see some of the biggest hits today, Der Rosenkavalier was the show of its time. So it was so famous that in the 1920s came the idea to produce the silent film based on the Rosenkavalier. So of course, Richard Strauss was asked to provide the background music. And so he basically used all the themes from the operas and created more or less 1 hour long music to accompany the silent film. So that was the beginning of, so to say, pre-Hollywood time. And
what year was that? Approximately. What year?
In the 1920s. In the 1920s.
So very early on of the film, because cinema only comes on the very beginning of 20th century, right? Edison makes the camera, and then on the 1901 or something like that, and so only 20 years after that, very early stage of cinema as well.
Yeah, but in the very beginning, it was just short clip of images, and you know, when the technology got more advanced, the camera were able to record longer scenes.
Exactly. So
that's why at the very beginning of the cinema or motion picture, creation of or production, you saw the film was just short segments, and the movement of the people were disjointed. Exactly. So not to count also that they were all black and white, because it was just picture quality also very blurry, no? And Richard Strauss was not alone. There were other composers also, due to the fact that life was very difficult after the First World War. Imagine if you were a composer, you needed to support your life, and they didn't have salaries, right? So it all depends on commission. So if nobody commissioned them to write music, or the money was not enough to pay, for writing one piece of music, you had pretty difficult life to sustain. So the business of motion picture started to bloom, and many famous composers in their days saw a chance to make good money if they would be writing music for film. Naturally, the company that commissioned these composers, they had a lot of backing. If they could engage actor, actress, the camera crew, and then producing films, it means they had quite substantial support. So I could also give you examples. Another very, very famous composer was Miklos Rozsa. Now, Miklos Rozsa, you know the name because in the 1940s, he migrated to the United States, and he lived for more than half a century in the United States. He died in the United States, but originally He came from Hungary. If I'm not mistaken, he was born in 1907. He came from Hungary, and in his teenage years, he left Hungary. So he went to Leipzig first and studied there, very serious composition, with a teacher who was a successor of another famous composer who was the leading composer in Leipzig, Max Reger. And his teacher was the successor of Max Reger. And he learned composition based on strict harmonic and counterpoint tradition. He studied also with another teacher in Leipzig who was the choir master of the Thomas Church. Now, Thomas Church, if you know, was the church where Johann Sebastian Bach worked for more than 20 years, and his grave is there. When he died, they buried him on the floor of Thomas Church. So can you imagine such tradition he had? Now, Miklos Rozsa, after maybe 5-6 years period in Leipzig, he went to Paris to try his luck, to make his living as a composer. There he met Arthur Honegger, who was originally Swiss, a composer originally from Switzerland, but spent most of his life in Paris. And thanks to Arthur Honegger, he was introduced to the world of motion pictures. You know why? Because in the 1930s, Arthur Honegger himself was asked to write the music for a famous film called Les Misérables. That's based on the novel of Victor Hugo. That's a classic novel. And, you know, in the 1930s, a French film director wanted to produce the story in the novel, which was known by everybody as a film. And he went to Arthur Honegger. And as I said before, Honegger could not resist, you know, the temptation to write music for film, even though he had no background prior to that, because of the money. So that was really hard time in the 1930s. You know, the history of our society after the First World War in 1914 and finished 1918. Exactly 1918 came, you know, you remember what it was the Spanish flu pandemic, which was actually much more awful than the coronavirus, which we are facing at the moment. Because at the time during the Spanish flu pandemic, there was no technology. There was no way to tell everybody to social distance. So many people died because of Spanish flu pandemic, and it lasted for some years until the population of the world somehow, you know, get a herd immunity because of the virus, right? So the Spanish flu pandemic following First World War, then at the beginning of 1930s, if you remember, it was an economic depression. 1930, 1931, the economy collapsed. So many people lost their job. Life became very difficult and poor. And then started the rising of the Nazi in Germany in 1933. So then a few years later, the beginning of the Second World War, 1939, 1945. So you can imagine the period between 1914 until the end of the Second World War were really terrible time for those people who actually lived in this period of 30 years. So going back to the subject of film music, Arthur Honegger introduced to Miklos Rozsa, you know, the possibility to make money, to write music for film. And Rozsa became so interested. Soon after, he moved to England. And in England, he started writing music for film. And then in the 1940s, as I told you, 1940 exactly, he migrated to Los Angeles. And there he continued. And he became so famous in Hollywood. Throughout his lifetime, he wrote no less than 100 film scores. Now I'm talking about Roja quite a lot because it's important to know that film music, when it's written by composer who understood compositions, the result is remarkable. If you would see the film, for example, your favorite Ben Hur. Ben Hur was, I think, published in 1959, right? The film Ben Hur, epic film. The music is, wow, it's like symphonic orchestra with such colorful imagination. You know, imagine to make Ben Hur, when you have the stadium, you know, filled with thousands and thousands of people, it was just imaginary, right? In the studios, it was not really the real thing. The film director had to multiply spectators and to see, and with the music of Roja, they really created one of the best movie that was ever produced in that time, with still quite limited technology compared to what we have today. And Ben Hur won many Oscars, as you know. Roja also wrote music for another epic, Julius Caesar in 1953. Incredible music. I must say, thanks to these people who actually were great composers in their time, writing serious music, when they actually made their name making film music in Hollywood, they created such skillful and such imaginative scoring, which actually you can actually play them in concert halls. So the music of Roja today, you know, people, as many symphonic orchestra, they would just bring it to the concert hall and you know, you can take a few parts of it. You can create a concert suite. I'm taking an example, Ben Hur, for example. There is a concert suite based on the theme from the film Ben Hur. And these stuff are popular and quite tricky and quite challenging to play for any orchestras. And really, really powerful music.
Yeah, I saw the tribute for John Williams. So if we jump a little to the quite recent time, I saw a tribute about to John Williams, to all his works, and who was the director? The Spielberg. Spielberg gave a honorary speech, and he played the scene from the E.T. So he just played only the visual without any sound. So he just played it for the audience, and then afterwards he played it with the music. So it shows what you were saying earlier, but how the music give a life, give a breath, give a something to. There's nothing there. I mean, it's not nothing, but it's less lively. The scenes is less lively, but for music, it breathes life, it breathes feeling, it breathes everything. Like
John Williams, yeah. Well, John Williams is a genius.
Yeah, exactly.
And God bless him. That I think it was yesterday. No, his birthday.
Yeah.
It was yesterday. He turned 89 and still active, working, awesome. Composing. As recent as, I believe it was only 2 years ago, the Vienna Philharmonic, the great Vienna Philharmonic, invited John Williams to conduct them in Musikverein, the famous Musikverein Hall in Vienna, a concert dedicated fully with the music that he composed for many, many different films. And you can watch some clip of those concerts on YouTube. There is also the TV production of that concert, which I saw. It was incredible. John Williams, he's not only a gifted composer, but also he's a very good conductor, and he also wrote quite a lot of pieces which have nothing to do with films. These are serious music. Some concertos, concerto for bassoon, for example. And for many, many years before, not anymore, he was conducting the Boston Pops. So Boston Pops, it's actually the Boston Symphony Orchestra minus the principal player. So they have a season called the Pop Season, but the Pop Season is not playing easy pop music. Many times they play very serious pop, like light classical. And John Williams was the main conductor of the Pop Season series of the Boston Symphony Orchestra for many years. So you could also see many of his concerts there. And throughout his life, you know, he collaborated with some of the greatest movie directors of our time. You know, George Lucas was one of them. And of course, Steven Spielberg, and you name it. I mean, he wrote, on the top of my head, you know all these films too, George, right? I mean, you know Jaws,
Yeah.
Star Wars, Superman, Indiana Jones, and then E.T. I remember you said E.T. earlier. And then what else? Jurassic Park. He wrote the music of Jurassic Park. Of course, Schindler's List with the violin solo of Itzhak Perlman. And JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the film JFK. And what else? Harry Potter. Harry Potter was also another film he wrote. The Adventures of Tintin. If you like the comic Tintin, you know, Steven Spielberg was the director of this film. Yeah, because there is only one film of Tintin which Spielberg did, right? That's the story of the secret of the unicorn. I love that book. I read it.
A very specific technique only used on that film. I mean, how he the visual. Yeah,
that's right. You as a film director, you might want to say a few words to your audience about this technique. I even want to hear it from you. Why don't you explain it?
I don't really know the details, but I think as a director or as a producer or whatever, it's always nice to have a connection with a certain guy for a certain position. Let's say that explains all the years span of years collaboration between Spielberg and John Williams and so on and so on. Like Tim Burton always works with Johnny Depp, that kind of things. So you always have your own band. So I always, if I make a commercial or anything, I always prefer to work this DP. I always prefer to work with this composer because I know I can talk easily and so on. So I think it's countless of and so many John Williams movies, John Williams music in Spielberg movies, like the composer for
they have a great partnership. They have a great partnership between Steven Spielberg as a film director with John Williams, you know, as his most preferred, most trusted film composer.
Yeah, it's like
you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned about the composer of the fat guy, Hitchcock, the Psycho.
Yeah, Alfred Hitchcock, right.
I was always working with that guy.
Alfred Hitchcock, as we all know, he was the master of sci-fi thriller films, right? And in his days, his most preferred composer was none other than Bernard Herrmann. Herrmann, written with 2 R and 2 N at the end, yes. And the two of them collaborated in 7 different films. You know, you can mention Vertigo was one of them, and another one was Psycho. And Bernard Herrmann, actually, he was also a great character. He was a composer primarily not known as a film composer. He was a conductor. He was quite a good conductor, and he conducted so many works of other people's music. For example, in America, you know, there was a great composer. His name was Charles Ives, and his music was very quirky, very difficult, the rhythm very difficult. Bernard Herrmann was one of the early champion of Charles Ives' music. He conducted a lot of music of Charles Ives and also other composers' music. And Bernard Herrmann, as it was with Miklos Rozsa, Arthur Honegger, Richard Strauss, Erich Wolfgang Kongol, he was also very meticulous in details in composition, very exacting. He knew exactly the technique of composition, coming from a very strict tradition. So these guys, they were not just writing music because the tune sounds good in the ears. It's not that, you know. If you listen to the music of Vertigo, you know, there were scenes in the music, in the film Vertigo, that made us think, oh, this music could have been written by Gustav Mahler or by Richard Wagner. Or if you would watch the film Psycho, you know, Herrmann used a string orchestra, only string orchestra, with all this jabbing chord, dissonant. These were done so skillfully, you know, it was like really thriller music in the best sense.
Yeah.
And as I said before, many of this music are actually popular concert music today.